The explosion hit before she heard it coming. Emma Hayes slammed into wet concrete, shoulder first. The container wall beside her was gone, replaced by fire and twisted steel. She rolled onto her back. The Maryland sky above the port was burning orange. Radio. Dead. 8 hostages. Warehouse 7. Execution countdown. 11 minutes. A voice boomed from the speaker array mounted across the container stacks. Amplified, deliberate, meant for her specifically. "We know who you are, Captain Hayes." Then, the traitor. She didn't move, because on the laptop zip-tied to the fence post 3 meters ahead, screen still glowing through the smoke, she could see her own face. Her classified file number, her sealed investigative record. Someone had handed them everything. Someone inside had done it again. The hearing room smelled like old coffee and institutional carpet. Emma Hayes sat at the end of a folding table, her hands flat on the surface, her uniform pressed to the point of pain. Across from her, 3 officers in Class A stared at documents they had already read. No one looked at her directly. That was the tell. When men who outranked you couldn't meet your eyes, the decision had already been made. She had been in this building before, 2 years ago, for a commendation review. The hallways had looked the same. The carpet was the same particular shade of government gray that existed in every administrative building she had ever entered, as if the Army had found one roll of it in 1987 and never ordered a different color. The smell of the coffee was the same too. Burned, institutional, the smell of a place that ran on caffeine and paperwork, and the determined pretense that the paperwork meant something. That time the officers had looked at her. Brigadier General Curtis spoke without looking up. "Captain Hayes, you understand this panel convenes not as a court-martial, but as an administrative review." "Yes, sir. And you understand the findings may nonetheless result in permanent separation." "Yes, sir." He finally looked up. His eyes were tired, not cruel. That was almost worse. Cruel she could work with. Cruel had an edge you could push against. Tired just absorbed everything and gave nothing back. 7 soldiers are dead, Captain. 4 of them were 22 years old. Emma said nothing. She was thinking about Specialist Marcus Webb, who had been 22 and had shown her photographs of his daughter on his phone 3 days before the ambush. A little girl with his same wide-set eyes, wearing a yellow dress, standing in a yard somewhere in Georgia. Webb had said her name, Amara, the way people said the names of things they were keeping themselves alive for. Emma had smiled and said she was beautiful, and Webb had said yes, she really was. And then he had put his phone away, and they had gone back to the mission brief. She had not thought about Webb's daughter in 8 months without also thinking about the locked door, the investigation, the codes, the specific configuration of evidence that had been arranged, like furniture in a room, to point in her direction. The intelligence breach that led to that ambush has been traced to your operational access codes. "I know what it looks like, sir." "Then you understand our position." She did. She had understood it since the moment she'd woken up in a Kandahar field hospital with shrapnel in her thigh and a colonel standing at her bedside with a face full of apology she hadn't trusted even then. She understood it the way you understood a locked door, completely and from the outside. "My codes were used," she said. "I didn't use them." General Curtis nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who had heard this before and could not afford to believe it. "Pending completion of the review, you are suspended from all operational duties. Your access credentials are revoked. You are not to discuss this matter with active personnel." He straightened his papers. "Do you have any questions, Captain?" She had about 40. She asked none of them. "No, sir." She walked out of the room into a hallway full of people who stopped talking the moment they saw her. Not loudly, not obviously. The conversations just dropped half a register. The eyes shifted. Someone who had eaten breakfast with her 6 months ago found something urgent to examine on his clipboard. The thing about institutional silence was its precision. It was not the silence of hostility. Nobody was cruel to her face. Nobody said anything she could respond to. It was the silence of managed distance, of people who had been told, or had decided on their own, that proximity was a kind of endorsement. She had watched it happen to other people before. Officers under investigation, soldiers with complicated histories. She had always understood it intellectually, the institutional self-preservation, the careful navigation of association. She had never been on this side of it. She kept walking. Outside, the December air hit her like cold water. She stood on the steps of the administrative building, hands in her jacket pockets, and looked at the parking lot. A crow was pulling apart something pale and unidentifiable near the dumpsters. The sky was the color of old concrete. A staff car was pulling out of the far entrance, moving in the deliberate way of vehicles carrying people who had somewhere important to be. She had nowhere to be. For the first time in 6 years of active duty, she had nowhere that required her. Her phone buzzed. "Meet me at range 7, 1 hour." No name. She didn't need one. Range 7 was decommissioned, the targets long removed, the downrange berm crumbling at the edges, the shelter roof missing 2 of its original 6 panels. The Army had newer ranges now, with digital scoring systems and heated observation booths. Nobody came here anymore, which was exactly why Colonel Jack Mercer used it. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the 15-meter line with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, staring at the empty berm. He wore civilian clothes, canvas jacket, worn boots, no insignia. He had the posture of a man who had spent 30 years in uniform and could never fully unlearn it. Even in a canvas jacket, even at 64, the spine was straight, the shoulders set, the weight distributed with the particular balance of someone accustomed to standing in positions that might require sudden movement. She walked up beside him and waited. They had known each other for 3 years, since she had been assigned as Special Operations Liaison, and he had been brought in as a DHS tactical advisor on a joint exercise that had gone sideways in a way that required people who knew how to think clearly under pressure. She had impressed him then by solving a problem that the exercise designers had assumed would take a full team. He had impressed her by knowing which problems were worth solving and which ones were worth walking away from. They had built the working relationship that practitioners built. Not close exactly, but calibrated. She knew how he thought. He knew how she worked. In a world where that kind of knowledge was earned slowly and lost fast, it was worth more than most things. "How'd they treat you?" he asked. "Professionally." That's their polite word for, "We've already decided." "Yeah." He turned to look at her. Jack Mercer was 64 years old and looked every year of it. Deep lines, gray at the temples, the particular stillness in his eyes that she associated with men who had seen the thing you didn't come back from and had come back anyway. He'd done 2 decades in Delta before a knee injury ended his operational career. Now he consulted for DHS, which gave him access to things he wasn't supposed to do anything with. "They're going to pin it on you," he said. "I know. Unless something changes. The investigation is being managed," he said it flatly, without editorial. "Someone with access to the filing system has been moving documents around, not deleting, just repositioning, making the chain of custody look clean in all the wrong places." Emma stared at the empty downrange. A rusted target frame leaned against the berm at an angle, half buried by sediment and seasons. Someone's name was scratched into it. She couldn't read it from here. "You have proof of that?" "I have enough to know that I don't have proof yet." He paused. "Your access codes were pulled from an archived DHS Army liaison file. The kind of file that requires a GS-15 clearance or above to open. That doesn't narrow it much." "No, but it narrows it enough." He looked at her directly. "Somebody with stars or a title signed off on accessing that file. which means this isn't a leak from the field. This is institutional. She felt the familiar cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, something more structural, the sensation of the floor shifting beneath weight that had nowhere else to go. She had been carrying a version of this feeling for 8 months, the specific weight of a truth she couldn't prove. And Mercer's words didn't lift it, they just clarified its shape. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I was supposed to be briefed in on the original investigation," he said. "6 months ago. I was read out before it concluded. Someone pulled my clearance from the review." He paused. "Same day your suspension was filed." Emma turned that over. "They cut you out to control the narrative. That's my read. So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the broken shelter roof, making a low note against the exposed framing. The sound of air finding gaps. The sound of structures that had been abandoned before they failed. Somewhere in the tree line, a bird made a sound like a question. "We wait," he said. "We watch. And when something moves, we're ready to move faster." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to her without ceremony. She unfolded it. A satellite image. A commercial port facility. Baltimore waterfront, from the look of it. The specific crane architecture. The configuration of container stacks along the south terminal. "What's this?" "Something I've been watching for 2 weeks." His jaw tightened slightly. "A pattern. Contractors with certain backgrounds moving through that facility. The kind of backgrounds that overlap with your ambush. You think there's a connection?" "I think there might be. And I think we have about 10 days before it either becomes someone else's problem or disappears entirely." He looked at her. 2 of the names match contractor IDs that appear in the Kandahar mission support documentation. Not the main file, the supplemental logistics appendix. The one that was processed through DHS infrastructure. She looked at the image more carefully. The container configuration on the south terminal, the specific geometry of the stacking, the narrow service corridors between rows. She had been in facilities like this before. She knew the terrain type. She knew what it felt like to move through it. If this is the same group, then they're not done. Whatever they were protecting in Kandahar, the arms pipeline, the vendor relationships, it's still running. And they have reason to believe you're a loose end. She looked at the image a moment longer, then folded it and put it in her pocket. "Sometimes the only court that matters," he said quietly, "is the battlefield." She didn't answer, but she didn't hand the photo back. The alert came 4 days later. Emma was in her apartment, running her 3rd mile on a treadmill she'd bought specifically because her building gym had too many people in it who wanted to talk to her about things she wasn't cleared to discuss. The apartment was a 1-bedroom in Bethesda, the kind of place that was fine and nothing more. The kind of place you moved into when you expected to be elsewhere in 2 years. She had been here 14 months. She had not bought any art for the walls. Her phone lit up on the shelf beside her. A news notification, followed immediately by a direct message from Mercer. "Turn on the news, Channel 4. She stepped off the treadmill and hit the television. The chyron read, "Hostage situation. Baltimore Marine Terminal. 8 confirmed captives." The anchor, a young woman trying to hold her composure, was reading from a teleprompter that was clearly being updated in real time. A group of what authorities are describing as former military contractors has seized control of a section of the Seagirt Marine Terminal in Baltimore, Maryland. 8 employees of a private energy infrastructure firm are reported to be held inside a refrigerated storage facility. The group has issued no formal demands, but has begun live streaming footage from inside the facility. Emma turned up the volume. FBI and DHS are coordinating response. Maryland State Police have established a perimeter. Army Special Operations assets are being mobilized. Her phone rang. Mercer. "You seeing this?" "Yeah." She watched the screen. The live stream footage they were showing, B-roll from a news helicopter, showed the south terminal of Seagirt Port. Container stacks. cranes dark against the evening sky. The same facility from his satellite photo. This is your pattern. It's the same group, I'm 70% sure. She could hear him typing in the background. The contractor profiles I flagged, 3 of them have identities consistent with the crew that got paid out after your Kandahar operation. Her hand tightened on the phone. Mercer, I know. This isn't a coincidence. No, he said, it's not. And whoever set this up chose this location, this method, and this timeline for a reason. A pause. They're not just taking hostages, they're building a stage. For what? I don't know yet, but I know you need to be there. His voice dropped slightly. This is the connection we've been waiting for. These people are tied to Kandahar, which means they're tied to whoever set you up. If we can get eyes on the operation, I'm suspended, Jack. My credentials are pulled. I can't exactly walk up to an FBI incident command and volunteer. I still have a DHS advisory role. I can get you attached as civilian support on the incident command. His voice was steady. Observer status only. You're not tactical. You're just there. Emma looked at the television. The live stream they were broadcasting had cut to ground-level footage from a vehicle near the perimeter. The container stacks were visible in the background, massive and dark, the sodium lights throwing orange pools across the wet terminal road. The same facility from his satellite photo, the same configuration she had been studying for 4 days. She knew that terrain now. She had memorized it the way she memorized all terrain she might have to move through. Not because she had expected to use it, but because studying ground was reflex, because her brain had been trained for 8 years to process space as a tactical problem, even when there was no immediate tactical problem to solve. When do we leave? She said. They arrived at the incident command post, a converted equipment staging area 3 blocks from the terminal perimeter, at 2100 hours. Mercer had credentials. Emma had a visitor badge and a civilian jacket over her old army fleece. Nobody looked at her twice. In a crisis, bodies with credentials moved freely. The IC post was controlled chaos. FBI, DHS, Maryland State Police, and a 4-person Special Operations Coordination element were crowded around a folding table covered in aerial maps and radio equipment. Coffee cups everywhere. The particular tension of people who had trained for this and were still afraid, the gap between preparation and the real thing, which was always wider than the training allowed for. Agent Diane Reyes, FBI Hostage Rescue Team Coordinator, early 40s, the kind of competence that announced itself through stillness, was running the briefing. She had the manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to have lost the parts of herself that panicked, and who understood that this was both a professional asset and a personal cost she had decided to pay. 8 hostages, all employees of Atlantic Grid Solutions, a private firm contracted by DOE for energy infrastructure maintenance. All U.S. citizens, mixed civilian and ex-military backgrounds. She tapped the map. They're being held in Refrigerated Storage Unit 7, here, on the South Terminal. Ambient temperature inside is approximately 4 degrees Celsius. We have a window of about 2 hours before hypothermia becomes a compounding factor. Emma studied the map. The refrigerated unit was deep in the container maze, 3 layers of stacking between it and the perimeter. Every approach route was a channel, straight, narrow, flanked on both sides by steel. The kind of terrain that made tactical movement a geometry problem with limited solutions. What are they asking for? Someone asked. No formal demands. The live stream is the communication. Reyes crossed her arms. They've said one thing directly. They want specific classified files released publicly. Files relating to she paused, choosing her word, a prior military operation. In her peripheral vision, Emma saw Mercer go very still. Which operation? The Special Operations Element lead asked. Reyes looked at her notes. Operation Garnet Watch, Kandahar Province, 8 months ago. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Emma kept her face completely neutral. She had been practicing for 8 months. The management of expression in rooms full of people making assessments. The discipline of presenting nothing that could be read as guilt or anger or the specific grief of someone who had been wrongly blamed for the deaths of people she had known. Mercer spoke, his voice even. What's the current SWAT disposition? HRT element is staged at the north perimeter gate. We're running thermal on the approaches. Reyes looked at the map. The problem is the container configuration. We lose line of sight at approximately 40 meters from the target structure. After that, we're moving blind. Drone coverage? Limited. The steel stacking creates significant radio interference. We're losing signal consistently past the second container row. A pause. We have one approach window that gives us the best concealment, the southwest maintenance corridor. But it's a funnel. If they've got eyes on that corridor, anyone moving through it is exposed for 60 meters straight. Emma looked at the maintenance corridor on the map. 60 meters of channeled movement with no lateral escape. She could feel the geometry of it, the specific exposure that came from moving in a straight line through flanked terrain, the way the walls turned protection into a killing box at the moment they became obstacles. She had been inside a port facility enough times to know exactly what 60 meters of steel flank corridor felt like under fire. She knew the ricochet geometry. She knew the sound. I can get eyes on the south terminal, she said. Every head in the room turned to look at her. Reyes looked at Emma's visitor badge, then at Mercer. Colonel, Reyes said carefully, your support personnel. Captain Hayes has operated in high-density urban environments with this specific terrain profile, Mercer said. She's here as an advisor. She's suspended. She's also the most qualified person in this room to read that corridor. A long beat. Reyes looked at Emma with a particular expression of a woman who had learned to make fast assessments of people under pressure. Not judgments exactly, but calibrations. She was reading Emma the way Emma had been reading the map. Observer only, Reyes said finally. You do not engage. You do not interfere with the tactical element. You report what you see and nothing else. Understood, Emma said. She looked back at the map, the southwest corridor, the refrigerated unit at the far end. Somewhere in Warehouse 7, 8 people were breathing cold air and waiting for someone to come. She thought about Specialist Webb's daughter in the yellow dress. She thought about the satellite photo in her jacket pocket, folded along the same crease she'd made 4 days ago. They moved at 22:17 hours. The HRT element was 6 operators, tight, professional, moving in pairs through the outer perimeter wire. Emma was attached to the rear pair as an observer, which meant she was 30 feet behind the last man with no weapon and no radio of her own beyond the borrowed unit clipped to her vest. The borrowed unit was already showing 2 bars of signal. The steel around them was eating it alive. The port at night had its own particular texture. The sodium lights threw pools of yellow-orange that made everything beyond their edges look like a different world. Not dark exactly, but differently lit. The way the edges of firelight look darker than actual darkness because the contrast is too sharp. The air tasted of salt and engine oil and the particular metallic cold of industrial water. Somewhere distant, a foghorn. Somewhere closer, nothing. And that nothing had a specific quality that Emma recognized as intentional. The ambient sounds of an active port had been suppressed. Someone had prepared this space. The container stacks rose 12 meters on either side. Old paint in faded reds and blues. Rust streaks running in long verticals from the upper corners. The occasional stenciled serial number in white, worn by weather. Above them, a thin strip of cloud-covered sky, the ambient light of the city reducing it to a gray-orange glow that gave no illumination at ground level. The lead pair held at the first corner. Hand signal. Hold. Emma scanned left, right. 4 corners, 4 potential positions. She checked the upper tiers. Nothing moving. The signal came. Advance. They moved into the maintenance corridor. The corridor was exactly as the map had shown it. 60 meters, flanked on both sides by container stacks 3 high. The surface underfoot a mixture of gravel and old asphalt cracked by freeze-thaw cycles. The footing required attention. At the far end, a gap in the stacking where a service road crossed. Beyond that, Warehouse 7. They were 20 meters in when Emma caught it. Not a sound. A reflection. A fraction of a second, barely there. The suggestion of glass catching sodium light at the upper edge of the container stack to her right. 3rd tier, approximately 40 meters ahead. The shape of it was wrong for the geometry. Not a rivet, not a corner edge, not a painted surface. The specific small oval of a lens. She opened her mouth. The shot came first. The lead operator went down hard, alive, rolling, vest taking the hit, but down. The second shot hit 3 inches from Emma's foot and sparked off the gravel. She was already moving, left, into the gap between containers, pulling the rear operator with her by his vest strap. Sniper, 3rd tier, right, 40 meters. The corridor erupted. 3 more shots, rapid, walking their way down the left wall. Not suppression, too precise. These were targeting shots. Whoever was up there was reading their movement before they made it. Emma pressed her back against cold steel. The borrowed radio crackled. HRT to IC, we are taking fire, southwest corridor, request immediate. Static ate the rest. The lead operator had made it behind a support pillar. He was shouting hand signals. 2 operators down. 1 confirmed down, 1 unknown. The remaining 3 were scattered. 3 separate cover positions, no line of sight to each other, radio failing. Emma's mind ran the geometry. Sniper, 3rd tier, elevation advantage, covering the entire corridor length. Whoever moved next died in the first 5 steps. The approach to Warehouse 7 was closed. Her radio gave a burst of static, and through it, a fragment of Mercer's voice from the IC post. Emma, abort, I repeat, abort the approach, IC is calling. Then another voice, through the external speaker system, amplified, calm. Captain Hayes. She went cold. We've been waiting for you specifically. The voice knew her name, not Hayes, not the suspended officer. Her name, her rank, in a tone that suggested the speaker had known them for some time and had been carrying that knowledge patiently. We have something to show you. On the container wall opposite her position, a projector image flickered to life. Poor resolution, but clear enough. A screenshot, her classified file, her access credentials, her operational history going back 4 years. And at the bottom of the document, a digital signature, an authorization stamp she didn't recognize. But she recognized the format, DHS, Internal Review, Senior Authorization. The timestamp on that signature was 7 weeks before her suspension. Someone had accessed her file 7 weeks before she was officially under investigation, before there was a formal basis to access it, before she had been designated a subject of inquiry, which meant the investigation had not discovered her. It had been built around a decision that had already been made. Emma stared at it. The image held for 10 seconds, then went dark. Her radio clicked. Mercer's voice, barely there through the interference. Emma, whatever you're thinking, don't. She looked at the far end of the corridor, at Warehouse 7. A sound reached her through the steel walls, muffled, attenuated by distance and steel, but unmistakable. The sound of a human voice at its limit, someone screaming. The countdown clock she'd seen on the hostage live stream before they'd left the IC post had read 11 minutes. That had been 9 minutes ago. She moved before she'd fully decided to. That was the honest accounting of it, not a tactical calculation, not a decision made with the full benefit of deliberation and time. It was the scream and the clock. and the specific arithmetic of a person who had spent 8 months watching the machinery of process fail, while real damage was done by people who operated in the gaps between procedures. She was not going to wait for authorization while the clock ran out. She broke left through a gap in the container stack, moving parallel to the corridor rather than through it. The sniper's sight line was fixed on the corridor approach axis. Off to the side, among the containers, she was a different problem. Smaller target, moving between obstructions, no clear line of sight from the third tier. She moved fast and low, one hand trailing the container wall for orientation in the darkness between sodium light pools. The gravel was wet, with the particular compressed density of gravel that had been rained on many times without drainage. Her shoulder from the earlier blast ached with each impact, the specific deep ache of bruised bone. She set it aside. Temporary problems were paid later. Behind her, she heard the HRT element regrouping, hushed positioning, tactical communication reduced to gesture and proximity. They were buying her movement by staying in their positions, keeping the sniper's attention on the corridor. The gap in the container stack opened onto a service alley, unlit, narrow, smelling of brine and old rubber. Ahead, the wall of Warehouse 7. Corrugated steel, pale under the ambient light. A rusted personnel door, padlocked with a chain through the handle hardware. She had 60 seconds, maybe less. She hit the door with her shoulder. Pain flared bright and immediate along the bruised arc from the earlier blast. The lock held. She hit it again, lower, at the hinge line. The hinges on this kind of industrial door were the weak point, not the lock, especially if the door had been aging in salt air. Something gave, not the lock, but the door frame itself, soft with rust and moisture infiltration. Third impact. The door swung inward on one hinge, the padlock still attached to a piece of frame that was no longer attached to anything structural. Cold air hit her like a wall. Inside, darkness. The kind of total industrial dark where your eyes never fully adjust. The smell was refrigerant and copper, and the sourness of people who had been cold and afraid for a long time. Her breath was visible immediately. She pressed against the interior wall and held, listening. Voices. Somewhere ahead and to the right. She counted 2, maybe 3 distinct voices. Low, controlled. The voices of men who were not panicking, which was more dangerous than men who were, because men who were not panicking were men executing a plan. Movement to her left. A figure, small, pressed against the shelving, turned toward her. A woman, late 30s, wearing a company vest. Her face was white with cold, and the particular gray-white of extended fear. Emma raised one finger to her lips. The woman nodded, barely. Emma pointed. How many? Held up fingers. The woman held up 8, then pointed deeper into the warehouse. Then made a gesture, hands bound at the wrists, fingers laced and pressed together. Emma nodded. She pointed at herself, then at the door behind her, then made a sweeping motion. When the noise starts, move toward this exit. Move fast. Keep moving. The woman looked at her for one more second. Then she nodded again, more firmly, the nod of someone who had decided to trust a stranger in a cold room and was committed to that decision. Emma moved forward into the dark. The interior of Warehouse 7 was approximately 40 meters wide and 60 deep, lined on both sides with refrigerated shelving units, the center occupied by a large metal support structure that ran the length of the building. The hostages were at the far end, grouped near the loading dock door. 8 of them, wrists zip-tied, seated on the concrete floor with the compressed posture of people who had been cold for a long time. Shoulders drawn in, knees bent, the body trying to reduce its own surface area against the cold. 3 guards, ex-military bearing, the professional body language of people who had rehearsed the positions they occupied. Emma counted the guards' positions, triangulated their sightlines, identified the dead zones, the angles where 2 sightlines didn't overlap, the spaces that were briefly unobserved in the regular patterns of movement that even professionals developed, because the brain defaulted to patterns and patterns had gaps. She was beginning to map the approach geometry when she heard the voice. Coming from a handheld radio one of the guards was carrying, the specific, flat, modulated quality of someone being patched through a secure channel, she caught 3 words before the guard turned away. "Hayes is inside." She stopped moving. How did they know? She had entered through a side door, in darkness, without announcing herself. The HRT element was still outside. Nobody had transmitted. Her borrowed radio had been silent, which meant there was a sensor she hadn't seen. Or, worse, someone had told them. Someone with knowledge of her entry that could only have come from an active feed on her position. The guard with the radio turned toward the back wall, speaking quietly. The other 2 remained at their positions, flanking the hostage group. The countdown, Emma estimated, was running in single digits. She had 1 play. It was not a good play. It was the only play available under the constraints of the environment, the positions, and the time remaining. Sometimes those were the only plays that existed, and the discipline was in recognizing them quickly enough to execute before the window closed. She stepped into the sodium light from the loading dock's emergency strip lighting, hands visible at shoulder height, and spoke loudly enough to carry the full length of the warehouse. "Stop the clock." All 3 guards turned. The room held for a fraction of a second, the specific, suspended moment when a new input enters a system, and the system has not yet resolved how to respond. "My name is Emma Hayes," she said. "Your boss knows exactly who I am, so let's skip the part where you point weapons at me and get to the part where we figure out what he actually wants." The guard with the radio looked at her for a long 3 seconds. He was reading her, the hands up, the civilian jacket over the army fleece, the specific quality of someone who had walked in on purpose rather than stumbled in by accident. Then he raised the radio to his mouth. "She's here. She walked in herself." A pause, static, then a new voice, not the guards, not the external speaker system. A voice that had an authority different from the authority of the men in the room. The voice of someone who had designed the architecture of this situation, rather than merely occupied a position in it. "Perfect. Keep her there. I'm coming down." One of the hostage group, a man in his 50s, company vest, a dark stain on his collar that had dried to rust, looked at Emma with the specific expression of someone who had spent several hours systematically running out of options and had just watched someone walk into the room who might be a new one. Emma looked back at him without expression. She didn't have a plan yet. She had a position, a room, 8 people who were still alive, and a countdown that had been stopped by her presence rather than running out against her absence. Sometimes that was enough to work with. Sometimes that was everything. The man who came down from the upper level of Warehouse 7 walked like someone who had spent a long time in command and never fully recovered from it. Straight spine, measured pace, the specific economy of movement that distinguished career military from civilian. Every step placed with intention, nothing wasted. He was in his late 50s, gray hair cropped close, a face that might have been called distinguished in a service photograph and now looked like something else. Hollowed out around the eyes, the mouth set in a configuration that suggested permanent calculation. The face of a man who had made decisions at a remove for so long that the remove had become structural, the way a river eventually becomes its own channel. Emma placed him in under 3 seconds. She had never met him face to face, but she had seen his photograph in her own investigative file, attached to the authorization chain that had suspended her. She had read his name in the report summary. She had spent 8 months with his name occupying a particular space in her thinking. Not quite hatred, because hatred required energy she didn't have, but something colder and more durable. Recognition. The specific recognition of the source of a problem. Deputy Director Alan Strauss, DHS Internal Security, Senior authorization. The man who had signed her file. 7 weeks before her suspension. He stopped 6 meters from her. The 3 guards held their positions. Behind Strauss, 2 more men had come down, larger, armed, moving into flanking positions without being told. Professionals who had done this kind of work before and knew where to stand without instruction. Strauss looked at her with something that might have been satisfaction. "Captain Hayes," he said, "I have to say, I expected you'd be harder to move, but you walked in yourself." The clock was running. It always is. He tilted his head slightly. "Do you know how long I've been managing this situation? Not just tonight. The entire situation. Kandahar. The investigation. You." She kept her hands visible. "Tell me." 2.5 years. He said it without particular emotion, the way a contractor reports a project timeline, the way men who had been doing something long enough report it. "The arms transfer had been running cleanly for 18 months before your operation created interference. You weren't supposed to be in that sector. No one was." A pause. "When you survived the ambush, you became a variable. So you used my credentials to blame me for the leak." "I used your credentials because they were available, and because an Army captain with a suspicious history was a much cleaner explanation than a DHS deputy director with a vendor relationship." His voice remained even. "You understand, it was administrative, not personal." Administrative. Emma heard it. She filed it exactly where it needed to go. Not in the part of her brain that processed emotion, but in the part that processed evidence. He had just confirmed everything, with witnesses present, on a live stream that was, she was now certain, still running. She had checked the camera when she walked in. The red indicator light, small and steady, mounted on the pillar 6 meters to Strauss's left. He had not turned it off. That was the thing about men who had operated inside systems for long enough. They forgot what it looked like when the system wasn't protecting them. They forgot that a camera was a camera regardless of who they believed was watching. Behind her, in the hostage group, someone coughed. The cold was doing its work. "What do you want, Strauss?" she said. "Closure." He folded his hands in front of him, a boardroom gesture, completely incongruous with the armed men and the refrigerated air and the 8 people sitting on the concrete behind her. "You're here. The hostages are here. The HRT element outside will be stood down within the hour when I call in a negotiated resolution." A thin smile. "And you will provide a statement confirming that the Kandahar intelligence breach originated with your operational unit. A signed witness statement." "And if I don't?" He glanced past her at the hostage group. "Then the clock runs." Emma held his gaze for a long moment. She was simultaneously running 3 calculations. What Strauss needed to believe in the next 60 minutes, what Mercer was doing outside, and what the camera behind Strauss was capturing. The 3 calculations intersected at a single point. She needed time. She needed Strauss talking. She needed him to believe she was considering his offer seriously enough to be managed. "Give me an hour with your guards." He blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me, 1 hour. I'll give you a statement. I just need time to think." She kept her voice flat. "You've been managing this for 2.5 years. You can give me an hour." He studied her, calculating. "An hour," he said finally. "My men stay in position. You sit with the hostages." He gestured to the floor beside the group. "And Captain, I should tell you, I know your Colonel Mercer is at the IC post, and I've already arranged for his advisory credentials to be revoked as of 40 minutes ago." The thin smile again. "You're on your own." Emma sat down on the concrete floor next to the man with blood on his collar. She was not on her own, but she needed Strauss to believe she was. The hostages had been in the cold for approximately 90 minutes. None of them were hypothermic yet. Strauss was too careful for that, she guessed. Too invested in clean outcomes to allow a death that would complicate his narrative. But they were past the point of shivering and into the deeper, more dangerous stillness that preceded real cold injury. The body spent enormous energy shivering. When it stopped, that wasn't comfort. That was the body making a different calculation. Emma moved through them systematically. Not rescue. There was nothing to rescue them with yet. Inventory. 8 people, 5 men, 3 women, ages ranging from late 20s to early 60s. She assessed each of them with the trained eye of someone who had done combat casualty care in the field, who knew the difference between people who were managing and people who were approaching a threshold. The oldest was a heavy-set man named Terrence. She learned his name in a whispered exchange over 30 seconds. He was sitting with his weight forward on his knees, breathing carefully, and when she looked at him directly, she saw the particular pallor around his lips that she associated with cardiac stress. She asked quietly if he had medication. He said he hadn't taken it since morning. She told him to keep his weight forward, keep his breathing slow, keep talking to the people beside him. Talking kept the core temperature up. It also kept people connected to the present rather than drifting into the particular passive state that cold and fear produced together. The youngest was a woman named Priya, late 20s, engineering badge still clipped to her vest. She had been crying at some point and had stopped, which was actually the more concerning state. The crying was the body processing fear actively. The stillness was the body giving up on processing and just enduring. "Keep moving," Emma said quietly to Priya. "Flex your feet, clench and release your hands. Don't stop." "Are you going to get us out?" Priya asked. "Yes." She said it without qualification because equivocation helped nobody in a cold room. Doubt was its own kind of cold. The man with blood on his collar, his name was Davis, she learned, leaned toward her. "You came in alone." "I came in ahead of the main element." That's a polite way to say alone. "The exterior element is still there. Their radio went down." "I know." Davis looked at her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who had served, not active military, but the particular steadiness of someone who had been in situations before, where the difference between functioning and not functioning was a choice you made rather than a state you fell into. She filed that. He was going to be useful when the noise started. "You're the one from the news, the investigation." "Yes." "The leak." "No." She kept her voice level. "The person they blamed for the leak." He considered that, then. "The man running this, Strauss, he mentioned you by name before you arrived, before any of this started." He paused. "He seemed to be expecting you specifically." "I know that too." "What does he actually want?" "My signature on a lie." She glanced across the warehouse at Strauss, who was speaking quietly with one of his guards, back partly turned. "He's not going to get it, but I need him to think he might for the next 40 minutes. She was also working a different problem in parallel. The sensor. How had Strauss known she was inside the moment she entered? She had checked the doorframe before she came through. No visible trigger mechanism. She had scanned the interior wall at the entry point. Nothing obvious. She looked at the overhead lighting strip. Emergency backup, battery-powered, mounted at intervals along the ceiling. Standard industrial spec. Except one of them had a secondary attachment she hadn't registered immediately. Small, black, mounted flush with the housing, approximately the size of a pack of gum. Passive infrared, consumer grade, the kind you could order online and install with 2 screws. Not police-grade hardware. Off-the-shelf hardware that somebody had placed here specifically and recently, the kind of preparation that took 20 minutes and left no visible trace if you weren't looking for it. Which meant this facility had been prepared, not just occupied, prepared. Strauss or someone working for him had been in this warehouse before tonight, setting sensors, checking sight lines, learning the terrain. They had known this warehouse was going to be used. They had known in advance. She filed that. The second problem, the 3 guards. Their positions formed a triangle with the hostages at the center. She counted ammunition. Both guards she could observe directly had magazines in carriers, standard load. She had no weapon. She had her body, the terrain, the cold air, and whatever she could manufacture from the environment. Against three armed, professional, alert guards in an open space, those odds were poor. She needed the odds to change, which meant she needed something to happen that she didn't control, something that came from outside, which meant Mercer. She looked at the loading dock door at the far end of the warehouse. It was sealed, a chain and padlock on the interior bar. But the seal had a gap at the base where the concrete had settled unevenly over years of freeze-thaw cycling. Not enough for a person, but enough for a radio signal if the source was close enough on the other side, and enough for something small and flat to pass through. She looked at Davis. The loading dock door at the far end. What's on the exterior side? He thought for a moment. Loading platform, serviced by the crane track. He paused. There's a maintenance panel about 5 meters left of the door, for the refrigeration system control. Is it accessible from outside without the terminal key? The panel? No, but... He stopped, thinking. The emergency cutout. It's a physical breaker, no key required. Fire code. If there's a refrigeration emergency, you need to be able to kill the system from outside without going through the facility. If someone tripped the emergency cutout, the refrigeration system would alarm. Loud. And the loading dock door releases automatically on the alarm. He looked at her. It's a safety feature. Where is the cutout physically? On the exterior south wall, yellow housing. You can't miss it. Emma closed her eyes for 2 seconds. She was running the sequence. Reflective tape through the door gap. 3 taps. Mercer finds the cutout, trips the breaker, alarm sounds, door rises. She has 4 seconds of guard distraction to close the distance. It was not a good plan. It was an improvised plan built from available materials in a cold room under time pressure. Those were the plans that existed in the field. You worked with what the environment gave you. Then she reached down and pulled loose a strip of reflective tape from her vest, the kind used for night visibility on body armor, approximately 30 centimeters long, bright enough to catch any light source at 50 meters. She folded it into a tight square and held it against her palm. She had a signal. She needed to get it to Mercer. She was working on the third element of the problem, Strauss himself, when her radio clicked. Not the borrowed HRT radio, which had been dead for 20 minutes. The narrowband unit clipped to her vest. A different frequency, the one Mercer had shown her 3 years ago when he'd explained how to maintain communication when official channels were compromised. He had said it then without drama, the way practitioners passed on useful information. If everything else goes down, this is still up. 1 click. Pause. 2 clicks. She recognized it immediately. It was not a code they had established. They had established nothing formally because formal establishment left records. It was something older, a field signal from Delta protocols that Mercer had passed on during training, unofficially, the way experienced men passed on the things that weren't in the manual because the manual didn't have room for everything that mattered. I'm here. What do you need? She couldn't respond. Any transmission would alert Strauss's people, who would be monitoring frequencies as a matter of basic operational security. But the signal told her everything she needed, that Mercer had found a way through the perimeter cordon, that he was outside and close, that the door was still open despite the revoked credentials, despite the IC post standing down, despite everything Strauss had arranged. Strauss had pulled Mercer's official standing. He had not pulled Mercer. She filed it and kept her face neutral. Strauss crossed the warehouse and crouched in front of her. The gesture was intended to read as collegial, meeting her at her level, the posture of a reasonable man having a reasonable conversation. It read instead as the gesture of someone who had calculated the optics carefully, who had been performing reasonableness for long enough that it had become his primary mode. 40 minutes left, he said. I'm thinking. Think faster. She looked at him directly. You mentioned the arms transfer. 18 months. Which vendor? His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A microsecond of recalibration. The question surprised him, not because of its content, but because she was asking it at all. Here, in this moment, in this configuration of power where she was the one with no cards. That's not relevant to your statement. It is to me. She held his gaze. If I'm signing a document that ends my career, I want to understand the full context of what I'm covering for. You owe me that much. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him calculating how much to confirm, how much to deny, whether there was any risk in filling in the details for a woman he believed had no options and no audience. His conclusion was visible in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. He decided there wasn't. Tactical equipment, he said, procurement bypass. The standard process adds 18 months to any significant contract. We found a way to move faster. He paused. It served legitimate operational needs. Through private contractors. Through efficient contractors. The same contractors who are standing in this warehouse right now. A beat. The relationship evolved. Emma nodded slowly, as if absorbing this. She was absorbing it. Every word he said was evidence, and the live stream camera was still running. She could see the red indicator light on the unit mounted to the pillar behind him. Small, steady, blinking on a 2-second interval the way live stream encoding software blinked when it was actively transmitting. He hadn't turned it off. She still didn't know if that was arrogance or oversight. She suspected it was the specific blindness of institutional people who had operated behind closed doors for long enough that they had forgotten what exposure felt like, who had confused the permissions their system gave them with the system's ability to protect them. I need more time, she said. You have 35 minutes. Then let me think. He stood and walked back toward his guards. Emma turned back to the hostages and leaned toward Davis. The loading dock door, she said. 3 taps on the steel. That's the signal. When you hear the alarm, you move. Everyone moves. Fast, in a group, through the door, and keep going south. Don't stop for anything. Davis nodded. He passed it in a whisper to the person on his left. Passed it to the next. A chain of whispers moving through 8 people in a cold room, all of them trying not to move their lips when the guards were looking. Emma folded the reflective tape tighter in her palm and waited. She manufactured the opportunity 20 minutes later. The youngest hostage, Priya, had stopped moving her feet, and the hypothermia clock was now running in earnest. Her lips had taken on a faint grayish cast at the edges, and when Emma pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, the pulse was slower than it should have been. The body was making its calculation. Emma made it a problem that required guard attention. She needs to stand up, Emma said loudly. She's going symptomatic. The nearest guard, younger than the others, early 30s, the kind of face that still carried the residue of the person he'd been before this work, looked at Priya and saw what Emma saw, a young woman going gray at the edges. Stand her up, Emma said. You're not trying to freeze them. Let her stand. The guard looked at Strauss, who was occupied with his radio on the far side of the warehouse. He made the call himself. He moved forward, put a hand under Priya's arm, brought her to her feet. It shifted the triangle by 4 meters. That was enough. Emma moved to the loading dock door in 6 quick steps, not running, which would have triggered everyone, but moving with a specific, purposeful speed of someone attending to a task. The speed that reads as purposeful rather than aggressive. She reached the door, pressed her palm flat against the base gap where the concrete had settled, and pushed the folded reflective tape through. She felt it clear the gap. She added 3 taps on the door steel, deliberate, evenly spaced, the same rhythm as Mercer's signal on the narrow band. She was back beside Davis in under 10 seconds. The younger guard had noticed. He was looking at her with the specific expression of someone running a calculation. She needed air movement, Emma said. The cold air pools at the base. Circulation helps. He stared at her for 3 long seconds. Then he looked at Priya, who was standing and who did look marginally better for it, and the calculation resolved. He looked away. Emma sat down and waited. 15 minutes later, the drone arrived. Emma heard it first, the high-pitched whine of a small UAV working against the wind off the harbor, close overhead. The sound moved. It wasn't a holding pattern. It was searching. Strauss heard it too. He moved immediately to the ventilation slit near the roof. Narrow, industrial, designed for airflow, not visibility, and looked out. They're running a drone. HRT standard procedure, one of his guards said. Get it down. Sir, we don't have the equipment to find a way. Emma watched this exchange with the attention she paid to moments when plans develop fractures. The drone was not standard HRT procedure. HRT hadn't been able to maintain signal through the container stacks. HRT didn't have a drone staged within the response timeframe that had elapsed. And the HRT element was still at the north perimeter gate, per the last radio traffic she'd heard. The drone was someone operating outside the command structure, which meant Mercer. She looked at the live stream camera. The red light blinked steadily. And then she heard it. Beneath the drone sound, a mechanical stutter from somewhere outside the south wall. The refrigeration alarm was a 2-stage system. A preliminary flutter as the power was interrupted, then the full klaxon as the safety circuit engaged. She was hearing the preliminary flutter. Someone had found the yellow housing on the exterior south wall. Strauss heard it too. What is that? The klaxon hit at full volume. It was louder than she'd expected. The emergency alarm for an industrial cold storage system was designed to be heard from outside the building with the doors closed, which meant inside the building it was physically painful. The sound hit the steel walls and bounced, multiplied, turned the air into something that vibrated. The loading dock door mechanism engaged. The chain went taut against the interior bar. 1 second, 2, and then the safety motor cycled, and the bar lifted and the door began to rise from the bottom. Strauss was shouting. His guards were moving toward the door, weapons up. The hostages were scrambling to their feet, Davis already pulling people upright, already moving them toward the rising door. Emma was moving too, but not toward the door. She went toward the nearest guard, the younger one, not away from him. He was turning toward the opening, focused on the new breach point, his threat assessment reconfiguring in real time. She closed the distance in 4 steps, one hand inside his weapon arm, her weight going forward and rotating, the takedown she had drilled 1,000 times. He went down. She took the weapon. The second guard was turning. Emma gave him one command, clearly, with a specific tone of someone who believed what they were saying. Get down. Get down right now. I am a federal officer, and this building is surrounded on all sides. He looked at her for the fraction of a second that the calculation required. He got down. The third guard, the one stationed closest to the loading dock, made a different calculation. He bolted through the rising door and into the darkness outside. Gone. Strauss had his own weapon out now. He was backing toward the interior stairs, weapon raised. The careful boardroom composure was gone. What remained was the face of a man discovering that a situation he had controlled was no longer the situation he was in. It's over, Strauss. You have one weapon, he said. You're still alone. The loading dock door was fully open now. The cold harbor air came through in a wave. Behind Strauss, the hostages were moving, Davis leading them, organized, fast, toward the open dock. Emma kept herself between Strauss and the group. A figure came through the opening, moving low, entering with the specific economy of someone who had been doing this since before Emma was in uniform. Carrying an old-frame SIG that had no business still being operational and somehow was. Colonel Jack Mercer, 64 years old, left knee complaining with every step, cleared the threshold and covered Strauss from the right flank. "Two weapons," Mercer said. His breathing was harder than he would have admitted. Emma could hear it. She could also see the way he was distributing his weight, most of it on the right leg. The left knee bent at the angle that meant it was bad tonight. He had found the cutout on the exterior wall, navigated the terminal alone and without authorization, and entered a building with an armed hostile inside, on a knee that had been compromised for 3 years. He had done it without hesitating. She held that for exactly the second it took to file it, and then she moved on to the next problem. Strauss didn't fire. That was the interesting thing. The thing Emma turned over later, when she had time to examine it properly. He had the weapon. He had motive. He was in the position of a man with nothing left to preserve by conventional means. And he didn't fire. She thought she understood it. Men like Strauss had spent their careers inside systems, authorization chains, bureaucratic structures, institutional processes. They operated through those systems, weaponized those systems, depended on those systems for the protection that allowed them to operate. When the system stripped away, when it was just two people in a room and a choice, the reflex was not decisiveness. The reflex was to look for the process. There was no process here. There was only consequence. He looked at Mercer. He looked at Emma. He lowered the weapon. Not all the way, but the barrel dropped 6 inches, the posture shifting from threat to the paralysis of a man whose plan had just run out of structure. "You can't prove the arms transfer," he said. "You have my voice. That's hearsay." "The stream's been live for 4 hours," Emma said. "You explained procurement methodology and vendor relationships to me in detail." She tilted her head toward the camera. "To that." Strauss turned to look at the camera. The red light blinked steadily, had been blinking since he had walked down those stairs and begun explaining himself to a woman he had believed was his audience of one. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Something moved through his face, not remorse, but something adjacent. The recognition of a specific kind of finality. The recognition of a man who had managed information his entire career and had just failed to manage the most basic piece of information in the room. "The stream is encrypted," he said. "DHS protocols. Nobody has the decryption key but my team." "Strauss," Mercer's voice was level. "I worked counterintelligence for 14 years. I know what a backup relay looks like. Your stream has been going to 2 places since you turned it on." He paused. "The second address isn't yours." Strauss went very still. The second guard was still face down on the concrete, hands visible, not moving. The hostages were clearing through the loading dock. Davis had the group organized and moving, the last of them passing through the opening into the cold outside. "The vendor," Emma said to Strauss, "give us the vendor chain and the transaction documentation." You don't have anything to negotiate with." She kept her voice flat. "The stream is running. Your guards are down or gone. The vendor chain is the only thing left that gets you into a courtroom rather than somewhere less formal." Strauss was quiet for a long time. The warehouse was almost silent now, just the residual hum of the refrigeration system, the klaxon having cut off when the door opened. The cold air from outside was moving through the space, mixing with the refrigerated air, making the temperature drop further. Emma could feel it on the back of her neck. Then Strauss sat down heavily on a packing crate. The specific way a man sat when the weight he'd been carrying was no longer being held by posture. "There's a partition on my laptop," he said finally. "Encrypted volume. The passphrase is Garnet 77 November." He looked at the floor. "The full transaction record is there. 18 months of it." Emma looked at Mercer. Mercer was already pulling out his phone. The moment the hostages began moving through the loading dock, the external situation changed. Emma had been tracking it in the background of her attention, the way trained soldiers tracked peripheral threat, even while focused on primary objectives. and she registered the change when the radio traffic on Mercer's secondary unit spiked. Through the open dock door, she could hear it, not just the narrowband frequency, but the broader IC band, suddenly active and confused. She borrowed Mercer's secondary radio. DHS coordinator is calling an abort on the HRT element. All teams stand down. This is a DHS supervised resolution. I repeat, all units stand down and hold position. Emma looked at Mercer. Who has authority to call off HRT right now? DHS has concurrent jurisdiction on domestic operations. His jaw was tight. And if Strauss made calls before he came down here, he arranged to have your credentials pulled 40 minutes ago, Emma said. He mentioned it directly. He was planning a clean exit. Use me for the statement, stand down HRT through the DHS coordinator, walk out of here with his support element providing cover. Which means someone else in his structure is still active and still has comms. The IC post was going to stand down HRT. The external cordon was going to open. And Strauss's support element, however many people he had staged outside the perimeter, the contractor professionals who had set up this operation, were going to move in the confusion of a negotiated resolution. The third guard who had bolted through the loading dock was already loose in the terminal. He knew which direction the hostages had gone. We have maybe 10 minutes before the perimeter opens, Emma said. The stream, Mercer said, still running, but running to where? She crossed to the laptop on the support structure. The stream interface showed two output addresses. Strauss had been right. The primary was DHS encrypted protocol, effectively invisible to outside monitoring. But there was a second field, a relay address that Strauss's technical team had set up to maintain stream integrity if the primary dropped. The second address was a public media server, an open relay, the infrastructure that news organizations used for live event coverage, designed to distribute to multiple endpoints simultaneously. Someone on Strauss's technical team had set this up, Emma guessed, as a failsafe they had never intended to activate. But they had built it in, and they had left it connected, and it was live. She pulled up the relay settings, currently set to private, password protected. But the relay was there, and the infrastructure was running. She changed the privacy setting. One click. Public. What did you just do? Mercer asked. I gave it an audience, she said. The impossible choice came 23 minutes into the standoff's second phase. Mercer's secondary radio was carrying two streams now. The IC frequency, still processing the confused signals from Strauss's support element, and the DHS coordinator attempting to manage a situation he had been given false information about, and the narrowband. On the narrowband, a new voice, female, clipped, the particular diction of someone who had learned to communicate under pressure and had been doing it long enough that it was just how she talked. Colonel Mercer, this is Assistant Director Sarah Kolb, FBI Washington Field Office. We have the stream. We need 60 more minutes to get authorization to move on Strauss's external support element. Confirm. Can you hold that facility for 60 minutes? Mercer looked at Emma. Emma ran the numbers. Hold the facility for 60 minutes meant Strauss secured at their position, 2 guards contained, hostages clear of the building. On its face, manageable. Strauss had given them the passphrase. The laptop documentation was accessible. The stream was going to its new audience. Except the third guard, the one who had bolted through the loading dock, was somewhere in the terminal. He had been near the dock when he ran. He knew the exit route, and he was armed and professional, and had just watched his operation collapse around him, which was the state of mind that produced people who made bad decisions quickly. 60 minutes. 8 civilians moving through a dark industrial terminal with one armed and motivated hostile loose in the container stacks. Emma keyed the narrowband. Director Kolb, I have 8 civilians exiting through the south loading dock. I have 1 armed hostile loose in the terminal, last seen moving northeast from the dock approximately 4 minutes ago. My people are in his field of movement. A brief pause. Can you redirect them to an alternate exit? Alternate exits require the southwest corridor that's been under sniper observation. I don't know if the sniper is still in position or if he's the same individual who fled the dock. Either way, the corridor is a funnel with no cover. Longer pause. What's your assessment of the threat to the civilian group? Emma looked at Mercer. He looked back at her. This was the choice laid out in its exact dimensions. Stay, hold Strauss and the secured guard in the warehouse for 60 minutes, document secure, stream running, Mercer's bad knee and old Sig, the only thing between a federal case and Strauss walking out of here on his own terms, if the support element moved faster than the FBI. Leave. Go into the dark terminal. Find a man who was armed and had nothing left to lose, and trust that Mercer, 64 years old, compromised knee, no official standing, technically unauthorized to be in this building, could hold two people until the authorization chain moved. The math was not good either way. If she stayed and the guard in the terminal found the hostage group, 8 civilians, 8 people with families, 8 people who had not signed up for this and had done nothing except work the wrong job on the wrong night. She would be inside and there would be nothing she could do. If she left and the support element came through the cordon, Strauss walked, the documentation walked, the vendor chain walked. 7 soldiers stayed dead with the wrong explanation on their files. Webb's daughter grew up with the wrong story about her father. Emma looked at Mercer. Can you hold him? He looked at Strauss, sitting on the packing crate, studying the floor. Then at the secured guard, still face down. Then back at her. His expression was the expression of a man who was being honest about the math and had already made his decision. Go, he said. I've held worse with less. She looked at him for a moment. The specific kind of moment where you are committing the face, in the voice, and the position of a person to a part of your memory that keeps things in case they need to be kept. If his support element comes through before cold moves, Emma. His voice was quiet and completely steady. The voice of someone who had been in positions like this before and had come back from them and was not pretending that coming back was certain, but was also not pretending that uncertainty changed the calculus. Go find your people. She went. The terminal at night was a different kind of obstacle than it had been on approach. Then she'd been moving with a 6-person tactical element, with radio coordination, with the structure of a known plan and people on either side of her. Now she was alone. 1 weapon, 7 rounds, a bruised shoulder that had gone from aching to the particular hot-cold throb of a joint that was running on adrenaline rather than pain-free function. Moving through 40 meters of stacked container darkness toward 8 civilians who didn't know they were being tracked by something that was not her. She moved along the exterior wall rather than through the container corridor. Longer distance, more obstacles, but it kept the stacked containers between her and the corridor's central sightlines. If the guard who had bolted was positioned in the stacks, which was the play a professional made, elevation and observation over ground movement, he would be covering the obvious routes. The corridor, the service road, the lit areas where the sodium pools gave him targets. She needed to be where the obvious routes weren't. The cold was deeper out here than inside the warehouse. The Maryland waterfront in December had a specific bitterness that was different from the cold of altitude or the cold of an interior space. It was the cold of moving air over open water, the wet cold that found the gaps in clothing and worked its way into joints and set into bone. The harbor smell was stronger here, salt and diesel, and the particular organic decay of water that processed millions of tons of freight. Her shoulder was tightening as the adrenaline metabolized, the bruised bone making itself known now that the immediate crisis of the warehouse was behind her. She adjusted her grip on the SIG and kept moving. The hostages were approximately 30 meters ahead. She could hear them, the crunch of gravel under 8 pairs of civilian shoes, the occasional hushed voice, the sound of people who were trying to move quietly and not quite managing it. They were moving too fast. Civilians under stress moved too fast, too loud, too grouped. The grouping was the problem. 8 people moving together sounded like more people than they were. If the guard was tracking by sound, she heard it, a footfall above her, the specific sound of weight on a container roof, steel on steel, not the creak of the structure, but the deliberate placement of a boot. Third tier, approximately 10 meters to her right, and it was moving, parallel to the hostage group, matching their pace, tracking. She stopped, calculated the vector. He was above and right, she was below and left. The hostage group was ahead and between them. The geometry was this: if she continued straight, she reached the hostages in time to warn them, but not in time to neutralize him before he had a clear downward shot. If she went up, she had the chance to reach him before he repositioned. But the ladder climb took time, and the hostages kept moving, and every second she spent climbing was a second the gap between them and the guard's sightline decreased. She looked at the container stack. The weld-on maintenance ladder was on the side of the nearest unit, approximately 3 meters from her current position. 5 seconds to the top, if she moved fast, and the cold rungs didn't cost her. She went up. The rungs were cold enough to hurt through her gloves. Not sharp pain, but the deep ache of metal that had been sitting in December harbor air for hours. The kind of cold that worked against grip and fine motor control. She moved as quietly as she could, which on steel rungs was not quiet, but the harbor wind was creating enough ambient sound to work with. At the top, she pressed herself flat against the container roof. The surface was rough with old paint and rust, and the accumulated grit of a working port, abrasive against her jacket, and scanned. 12 meters to her right, a figure in dark clothing, prone on the container roof, weapon extended toward the ground below. His attention was entirely on the hostage group moving underneath him. He was waiting for them to clear the shadow of the adjacent container stack, waiting for the moment they moved into the sodium light pool where he had a clean sightline. She had approximately 8 seconds before that moment arrived. She had one option, and it was not shooting him, even with the shot geometry available. A gunshot on a container roof in this terminal at this moment would bring every element converging. HRT at the north gate, Strauss's support element wherever they were staged, the IC post, every person in this operation, friendly or hostile. And the hostages were 30 feet below. In the confusion of a converging response, in the dark, 8 civilians without tactical training were the most likely casualties. She moved. 12 meters of container roof in the dark. The surface was uneven. The seams between container panels, patches of rust. One spot near the center that shifted slightly under her weight and made a sound she held her breath after. The man was focused downward. He didn't turn until she was 4 meters back, at which point the peripheral motion registered and he started to come around. There was a half second of recognition in his eyes. Then she closed the remaining 4 meters. What followed was not a long fight. He was larger, broader across the shoulders, heavier by 30 pounds. She was faster and had the momentum of approach, and was angry in the particular cold and focused way of someone who had been patient for 8 months and was done being patient. She came in low and inside his weapon arm, one hand controlling the barrel, her shoulder taking his chest, weight going forward. His weapon discharged. Once, the round going wide and down into the gravel below. And then they were grappling on the container roof, and the weapon was no longer in play because it had gone over the edge, and she heard it clatter on the gravel 4 meters below. 30 seconds of hard physical work. The container roof was not a forgiving surface to work on. Every impact registered, the bruised shoulder screaming through 2 of those impacts. And he was strong and trained and not giving up easily. But she had the better position from the initial takedown, and she kept it, and at the end of 30 seconds he was face down on the container roof with her knee in the center of his back and his arm at the angle that made further struggle a counterproductive idea. "Stop moving," she said. He stopped. He was breathing hard. So was she. Below her, the hostages had frozen at the sound of the scuffle, the scrape of boots on steel, the single shot, the impact sounds. 8 upturned faces, pale ovals in the sodium light, staring up. "Keep moving," she said. "South Gate, there are people waiting for you there." A beat. Nobody moved. "Move." They moved. She looked down at the man under her knee. He was breathing hard but intact. No injuries that would require medical attention before the FBI got to him. She reached for her vest and remembered she had used the last of her zip ties on him. She looked around the container roof. There was a length of electrical cable coiled near the maintenance hatch. Old, stiff with age and cold, but functional. She cut a section with the edge of the container's latching mechanism. It took 3 minutes and was undignified, and used it. Then she climbed down. 7 rounds left in the SIG. 8 civilians heading toward the south gate. One arms dealer sitting in a refrigerated warehouse with a 64-year-old Delta veteran who, as of 30 minutes ago, no longer had an advisory credential, an official role, or any legitimate authority in this operation. Who had come anyway? She started running. She heard the shot before she reached the loading dock. Single round, inside the warehouse. The specific flat crack of a pistol in an enclosed steel and concrete space. Not the rolling boom of an outdoor report, but the hard, compressed percussion of a round fired where sound had nowhere to go. She registered it at 50 meters and didn't slow down. She came through the loading dock, low, weapon up, sight lines sweeping in the sequence she had run 10,000 times in training, and a smaller, more consequential number of times in situations that were real. Left, right, center, elevation. Mercer was standing. He was at the far end of the warehouse, weight slightly favoring his right leg. She caught that immediately and filed it. The secured younger guard was still on the floor in the position she had left him. Hadn't moved, face down, hands behind his back. Strauss was on his packing crate. The second guard, the one who had gotten down during the loading dock sequence, the one Mercer had been managing alone, was against the far wall. His weapon was on the floor, 3 meters from him. His hands were raised. There was a fresh tear in his jacket at the left shoulder. The fabric parted cleanly, where the round had passed close enough to do that, but no more. Mercer lowered his SIG when he saw her. Not all the way. The barrel came down to a carry position, not a holster. There was still a room to clear, and he knew it. "The guard tested me," he said, "on Strauss's instruction. That would be my read." He glanced at the guard against the wall, who was looking straight ahead with the careful neutrality of someone trying very hard not to be the most interesting thing in the room. He knows now. Emma cleared the remaining space, both corners, the area behind the support structure, the shelving alcoves where someone could have staged. Clean. She came back to Mercer's position and looked at him properly. Up close, the cost was more visible. He was breathing with the careful, metered quality of someone managing pain. The specific, deliberate rhythm of a man who had learned the discipline of not showing how much something hurt, applied to a situation where it had been hurting for a while. The knee. She had known about the knee since their second year working together. A delta injury from a training accident in Fort Bragg, the kind that was never quite right afterward, that responded badly to cold and long static holds, and exactly the kind of 20-minute lone vigil he had just completed in a refrigerated warehouse. She didn't ask if he was all right. He was standing and the guards were contained. That was the relevant data. "The hostages are out," she said. "All 8. South gate, moving toward the perimeter." Something in his posture shifted. Very small, the kind of change you only caught if you had been watching a person long enough to know what their baseline looked like. A fraction of tension releasing. Not relief, exactly. Something more precise than relief. the confirmation of a specific calculation that had been running. "The loose guard?" he asked. "Secured. Container roof, south stack. Cable ties." She paused. "Improvised." The corner of his mouth moved. "How improvised?" "Electrical cable. It took 3 minutes and I'm not proud of it." He didn't say anything, but the look he gave her was the look of a man who understood that the dignity of the method was substantially less important than the result, and who was glad the result had been achieved. She crossed to Strauss. He had not moved from the packing crate during the exchange. He was looking at the floor between his feet with the focused inward expression of a man running numbers that were not producing good outcomes. When she crossed to him, he looked up, and she saw in his face the particular quality of a person who has spent several hours watching their architecture collapse from the inside, and is now at the stage of accepting the geometry of the ruin. "On your feet," she said. He stood slowly, with the measured movement of a man no longer in a hurry, because urgency had become irrelevant. "The external support element," he started, "is not coming," she said. "Your contractors have phones. Someone in that group checked the news in the last 40 minutes. The stream went public. They've done the math." He looked at her. She held his gaze. He looked away. They moved Strauss and both secured guards toward the loading dock at 2,341 hours. Emma led, Strauss in front of her, hands at his sides. Mercer was behind, covering the two guards. The one from the floor, helped upright, moving under his own power, and the one from the wall, who had been disarmed and was now compliant with the specific and complete compliance of someone who had very recently received a clear demonstration of the consequences of the alternative. The dock door was still open. The cold Maryland air came in as they approached, the particular waterfront cold that carried salt and engine oil, and the distant metallic smell of the bay. Emma stepped through first and came to a stop. The service road outside the loading dock was not empty. The HRT element was there, 6 operators, the same 6 who had been with her in the Southwest Corridor 3 hours ago. They were not in tactical configuration. They were standing in the road with a particular posture of people who had received new orders and were waiting for the situation to resolve itself into the shape the orders described. Behind them, portable lights had been set up, 3 of them, battery-powered, the kind that turned a dark industrial space into something that looked like the edge of a film set. And standing to the left of the HRT element, with the stillness of a person who had been waiting in exactly that spot for a specific outcome, and was now watching it arrive, Agent Reyes. She looked at Emma, at Mercer, at Strauss. The sequence took 3 seconds and communicated a significant amount. "Captain Hayes," she said, "Agent Reyes. I've been watching your stream." A pause. "The Washington field office has been watching your stream." Another pause, longer. "So has CNN." Emma absorbed that. She had made it public. She had changed one privacy setting in a live stream interface in a refrigerated warehouse in Baltimore, and CNN was watching it. She spent a moment with that information, turning it over. "How long?" she asked. "Approximately 45 minutes. Reyes walked forward. Her eyes stayed on Strauss as she moved. "We have a lot to discuss. But first," she stopped in front of him. She produced her credentials and held them at eye level, which under the circumstances was more gesture than legal necessity. The credentials were not the instrument of arrest. The situation was. "Deputy Director Strauss, you're under arrest. Special agents will join us in approximately 3 minutes." Strauss received this information without visible reaction. He had the look of a man who had moved past the stage of reactions and into the stage of processing. He looked at Emma one more time before Reyes moved him away. It was a long look, not hostile, not pleading, something more complex. The look of a man recalculating a variable he had underestimated, performing the post-mortem of a plan that had failed at a specific point and trying to identify exactly where. Emma met his gaze without expression. He looked away first. He always would. The next 90 minutes were procedure. FBI, Washington Field, established jurisdiction at 2,348 hours. ADHS Internal Security Coordinator, who had been managing the stand-down order for HRT, a GS-15 whose name Emma did not retain, was placed in a secure holding area at the IC post, pending an examination of his relationship to Strauss's operational structure. The phrase, "under examination," was used. Emma had been in enough investigations to understand the range of outcomes that phrase could eventually produce. She gave her initial statement in the back of a black Suburban that smelled of synthetic upholstery and the ghost of many previous coffees. Two agents, professional, thorough, the right questions in the right places, the questions that showed they had watched the stream and understood its structure, and were now building a secondary architecture of verification around what they had seen. She told them everything in chronological order. The hearing, Range 7, the satellite photograph, the IC post, the southwest corridor, and the sniper. Her entry through the personnel door, Strauss's admission and the specific language he had used, the stream relay, the loading dock sequence, the container roof. She told them without editorializing, without emotional color, in the flat and sequential manner of a soldier accustomed to after-action reporting, because that was what this was in the end, an after-action. The action was over. The reporting was what remained. The younger agent, barely 30, still carrying in his face the visible capacity for being affected by things that more experienced people had learned to process differently, looked at her when the statement was complete. "Captain Hayes," he started, "for what it's worth—" "Do the work," she said, not unkindly. She looked at him directly. "The statement is the beginning, not the end. The vendor chain documentation, the transaction records, the full authorization trail from Strauss back to the original Kandahar procurement. That's the work. Do it right." She paused. "That's what it's worth." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. She stepped out of the Suburban. The terminal was in the organized activity of aftermath, the methodical, deliberate movement of a large operation in its decompression phase. Lights everywhere now. Vehicles. Personnel in FBI jackets moving with clipboards and evidence bags. Somewhere in the container stacks, a clearing team was still working, their tactical lights making slow sweeps across the steel. She found Mercer at the exterior wall of the IC post building, leaning against it, weight on his right leg, taking the pressure off the left knee. Someone had found him a paper cup of coffee that he was holding in both hands with the grip of a man extracting warmth rather than drinking. He looked up when he heard her approach. "Done?" he asked. "First pass." She leaned against the wall beside him. "There will be more tomorrow." The debrief. Debrief, then the full statement, then probably a second debrief when the field office has reviewed the vendor documentation. She looked at the activity in the terminal. "It's going to be a long week." "Several long weeks," he said. "Yes." They stood in the cold for a while. Neither of them said anything. This was one of the things she had always valued about working with Mercer, the understanding that silence between people who had just been through something difficult was not a gap to be filled. It was part of the processing. It had its own structure and its own purpose. "The knee," she said finally. "It'll be fine. You were favoring it. I was also right." She almost smiled. She didn't quite. But she was closer to it than she had been in 8 months, and that was something. The footage, 14 seconds of broadcast, ran on continuous loop across 3 cable news networks for the following 72 hours. Emma watched it once, alone, 2 days later in a hotel room in Washington where she was preparing for the FBI debrief. She had avoided it until then, not from emotional avoidance, but from the practical understanding that watching coverage of an event you had been inside was a specific kind of cognitive interference she didn't need while she was still building her formal account. When she watched it, She watched it with the detached attention of someone watching surveillance footage of a building they worked in. Familiar geometry, known people, events she remembered from the inside being shown from the outside. The camera had been positioned on the pillar 6 meters to Strauss's left. The angle was slightly elevated. It caught his face directly, her face in three-quarter profile. The audio was better than she had expected. The refrigerated air had reduced ambient noise, and the warehouse's steel walls had created a kind of acoustic compression that made voices carry clearly. The arms transfer had been running cleanly for 18 months before your operation created interference. She heard her own voice on the recording, and it sounded, as her voice always sounded in recordings, slightly different from how it sounded from the inside. Flatter, more controlled. So you used my credentials to blame me for the leak. I used your credentials because they were available, and because an Army captain with a suspicious history was a much cleaner explanation than a DHS deputy director with a vendor relationship. Then, the pause that had felt much longer in the room than it looked on screen. It was administrative, not personal. She watched it to the end of the 14-second clip. Then she closed the laptop. The word that would attach to Alan Strauss for the duration of his trial and for as long as the coverage lasted was administrative. She had understood when he said it that it was the specific word that would make people angry, not the admission of guilt, which was abstract, but the tone of it, the bureaucratic register, the language of process applied to the deaths of 7 soldiers and the destruction of a career and the careful manipulation of an institutional investigation. Men who had served would hear that word and know exactly what it meant. They had seen the administrative before, the decisions made at a remove by people who were never in the room where the consequences landed. The paperwork signed by hands that never held weapons and never stood over the bodies the paperwork eventually produced. Administrative, not personal. She had handed him the opportunity to say it. She had known approximately what he would say because she had read his file and understood how he thought. Men like Strauss explained themselves in the language of management because that was the only language they had for what they had done. She had given him the audience. She closed the laptop and went back to her debrief preparation. The direct exchange, the one that mattered more to her than the footage, more than the arrest, more than the stream, happened in the 90 seconds between her emergence through the loading dock and the moment Reyes reached Strauss with her credentials. In that window, with the terminal lights going up around them, and the HRT element visible at the end of the service road, and the organized machinery of consequence bearing down from multiple directions, Strauss turned to Emma. He spoke quietly, in the register of someone who believed they were sharing an insight. "You understand," he said, "that this won't fix it." She looked at him. "The 7 soldiers, the investigation, your reputation, the years you spent carrying this." His voice was even, almost gentle. The gentleness of a man who believed he was being useful. "Systems like this don't disappear when I go to trial. Someone else steps into my role. Someone else manages the next file. Someone else makes the next administrative decision." He paused. "You know this." "Yes," she said. "So what exactly have you accomplished?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer, because she was choosing the right one from the several available. The one that was true rather than just satisfying. 7 families will know what happened to their sons, she said. He waited as if expecting more. "That's not nothing," she said. "And you?" he asked. "Your career, the years, the things you lost while this was running, none of that comes back." She had thought about this in the Suburban, between the statement and stepping back out into the cold. She had thought about it in a specific and honest way, without the protective layer of narrative that people built around difficult accountings. She had thought about the 8 months, the hearing room, the hallway with the people who stopped talking, range 7 in the photograph, and the slow accumulation of Mercer's careful, measured assistance. The 7 names she had carried. "No," she said, "it doesn't come back." Then, "But you won't be able to do it again." She held his gaze. "And the record will say what actually happened, and the families will know." She paused once more. "And I'll know that I didn't sign the statement." He stared at her. There was a long silence. Not the silence of a man with no response, but the silence of a man encountering a value system he had spent his career managing around and had never quite understood from the inside. "You could have been reassigned," he said finally, "rebuilt somewhere else. People like you always find a way." "Maybe," she said, "but I would have known what I'd signed." He seemed to be genuinely considering this, as if it were still an intellectual problem, as if the distance between his position and hers was something that could be analyzed and resolved. It couldn't. That was the thing he would never quite understand. Some distances were not analytical. They were categorical. Reyes reached them before he could say anything else. 6 weeks later, the vendor chain documentation had been fully processed by the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. 37 transactions across 18 months. 11 contractor entities, 4 of them domestic. 2 foreign intermediaries whose names were under seal, pending parallel investigations by Allied Services. The total value of the transfers, tactical procurement bypasses routed through a series of shell vendor relationships, was a number that had appeared in the classified briefing summary and would eventually appear redacted in the public indictment. 4 individuals beyond Strauss were under federal indictment. 2 had retained counsel and entered not guilty pleas. 1 had retained counsel and was cooperating. 1 had retained counsel and was cooperating extensively in the particular manner of someone who had done a precise calculation about the difference between cooperation and non-cooperation and found the result unambiguous. The Kandahar investigation had been formally reopened under a new oversight structure. The original investigative file, the one that had been managed, in Mercer's term, through careful repositioning of documents rather than deletion, was under forensic review. The chain of custody that had pointed at Emma's access codes had been reconstructed, and the reconstruction showed a different picture from the one the original investigation had produced. The Army moved at the speed it moved. Emma had known this going in. She had known it through the original investigation, and through the 8 months of suspension, and through the process that was now running in the other direction. Institutional correction was not fast. It was thorough, eventually, when the people doing the correcting were doing it correctly, but it was not fast. She had found a way to be patient with that. She was not sure she had forgiven it. The notification of the 7 families was handled by a family liaison officer named Sergeant First Class Dana Rowe, who had been doing family notification work for 6 years and had the particular combination of steadiness and humanity that the work required and that very few people could maintain for 6 years without losing one or the other. Emma had asked to be told when the notifications were complete, not to be present for them. She had thought about it and decided that her presence would not have served the families. It would have served her, and the two were not the same thing. Rowe told her afterward, in a brief phone call, that the response had been, she paused, searching for the accurate word, complicated. Emma understood that. She had known it would be. Grief that has been misdirected for 8 months does not simply redirect. It does not rotate cleanly on its axis and point the correct way and remain unchanged. It goes through a process of its own. The discovery of the misdirection, the anger that the misdirection occurred, the specific difficulty of reorienting something that has calcified into a particular shape. Some of the families had been angry at the Army for the original finding. Some had been angry at Emma specifically. She had known this through mutual connections, through the occasional piece of public commentary in the months after the investigation. She had not taken it personally because she had understood it. When people needed a face for the thing that had destroyed them, they used the face they were given. The investigation had given them hers. She thought about Specialist Webb's daughter in the yellow dress. She thought about that for a while. Then she put her phone down and went back to her debrief preparation. The reinstatement ceremony was, by Emma's preference and explicit request, small. The Army had offered something larger, a formal restoration with full protocol, officers in dress uniforms, the visible apparatus of institutional acknowledgement. She understood why the offer had been made. Institutions needed visible correction the way rooms needed windows. Not because the room couldn't exist without them, but because without them the air went stale, and the people inside forgot there was a world outside the walls. She had asked for a room, a few people, and the documents. The room was a conference space at Fort Meade, with a window that looked onto a parking lot and a December sky that had been the color of old concrete for 3 weeks running. The people were her direct chain of command, 2 witnesses from her operational unit, Agent Reyes, who had been invited as a professional courtesy and had accepted with the same directness with which she did everything, and Colonel Jack Mercer. Mercer had been reinstated as a DHS consulting advisor the previous week, under a new scope agreement that he had insisted be written by someone outside the Internal Security Division. The terms were narrower than his previous arrangement. He had not objected to the narrower terms. He had objected briefly and specifically to one clause about information sharing protocols, gotten it amended, and then signed. The officer conducting the reinstatement was a brigadier general she had not met before, a man with a direct and unhurried manner that suggested he had been selected for this particular function precisely because he had that manner and understood its value here. He read the formal language of restoration, clear, procedural, specific. She received the documentation. She was returned to active duty status, Special Operations Liaison, effective immediately. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then General Curtis spoke. He was not formally part of the ceremony. He had come anyway. He was standing near the window, still in his Class A's, with the same tired face she had last seen across a folding table in a hearing room 8 months ago. He had looked at her then with the eyes of a man who could not afford to believe something he suspected might be true. He looked at her now with something different in the same eyes. "Captain Hayes," he said. "Sir, the panel's findings have been formally vacated." He paused. The pause had weight, not the weight of reluctance, but the weight of a man measuring the distance between what protocol required and what the moment actually needed. "The record will reflect the correct determination." "Thank you, sir." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through something, the specific internal calculation of a man who understood that what had happened required more than the formal language of vacated findings, and who was also a man of a generation in formation that had not given him an easy vocabulary for the space beyond that language. "For what it's worth," he said, and stopped. She let him stop. She didn't fill the silence for him. He looked at her directly. "It was wrong," he said. "The finding was wrong, and the process that produced it was wrong, and I was part of that process." The room was very quiet. "It's worth something, sir," she said. "It matters that you said it." He nodded once. The nod of a man who had paid a debt he could not fully pay, and knew it, and was paying what he could anyway. It was enough. For both of them, she thought, it was the right amount. Afterward, in the parking lot, the February cold was serious. Not the wet cold of the port night, but the dry, bone-specific cold of a Maryland winter that had been running for weeks and had found every gap in every piece of clothing she owned. The bare trees at the lot's edge moved in a wind off the Chesapeake that came in low and steady, the kind of wind that didn't gust but didn't stop. Mercer was standing at his car, keys in hand, not quite leaving yet. She walked over. "How do you feel?" he asked. She gave the question the consideration it deserved. "Like something ended," she said, "and like that's different from it being over." He nodded slowly. He understood the distinction. It was the distinction between a chapter closing and a story ending, between the resolution of a specific thing and the resolution of everything that thing had touched. The families still finding their way through their reconfigured grief. The trial that would run for months. The contractors whose entities were dissolving, but whose decisions had already made their marks. The 7 names that were not erased by the correction of the record that had misidentified their cause of death. The trial will take most of the year, he said. I know. And the Army inquiry, the full review of the Kandahar file, the procurement chain, that's 18 months, maybe 2 years. I know, Jack. And even after all of that, he stopped. He had a specific honesty that she had always respected. The honesty of a man who would not round up the difficult parts of a true thing to make it easier to hold. The system that made this possible doesn't get fixed by one trial. You know that. Yes, she said. They stood in the cold for a while. A staff car moved through the far entrance of the lot, deliberate and unhurried. A crow landed on the light pole at the lot's edge and sat there in the wind with the equilibrium of something that had been doing this for a long time. What you said at Range 7, she said, about the battlefield being the only court that matters. He waited. I've been thinking about that. She looked at the sky, the same old concrete gray it had been for weeks. I think you were right that night, in the specific sense you meant it. There wasn't another path to the evidence. The battlefield was the only way in. She paused. But it can't end there. No, he agreed. The statement, the debrief, the trial, the families. She looked back at him. The record being corrected, even slowly, even imperfectly, that's not separate from the mission. That's the second half of it. He considered this for a moment with the seriousness he gave to things he was actually considering, rather than things he was performing consideration of. The battlefield makes the rest possible, he said, and the rest gives the battlefield its meaning. She thought about that. Yes, she said, that's it. They stood there a moment longer. The wind moved through the bare trees, and the crow sat on its pole, and the parking lot held its gray, ordinary peace. Then she said, "Thank you, Jack." He looked at her. He knew she meant Range 7, and the satellite photograph, and the narrow band signal through the terminal dark, and the 20 minutes alone in a cold warehouse with a bad knee, and no credentials, and no official standing whatsoever. You would have done the same, he said. She thought about the container roof and the decision that hadn't felt like a decision. Yes, she said, I would have. She got in her car. The Maryland sky was the same color it had been for weeks. Old concrete, flat, the light going out of it early. She drove through the base gate and onto the highway, and the city opened up around her in the particular way of cities in winter, stripped of the softening that came with leaves and warmth, the bones of the place visible. Somewhere in Washington, in a building she would visit many more times before this was finished, a process was running. It was running slowly in the way of institutions, and it would be imperfect in the way of all human constructions, and it would not give back the 8 months or the 7 soldiers or the things that had changed permanently. But it was running, and the record would say what had actually happened, and the families would know. She drove. Your name was never the problem, Captain. The truth just needed a witness.